When most people picture Japan, they think of the main archipelago off the coast of Korea. These islands, Honshu, Hokkaido, Shikoku, and Kyushu, as well as their smaller surrounding landmasses, are where the overwhelming majority of the Japanese population live. However, further to the south, there lies another often forgotten member of the Japanese family, Okinawa. This small island is home to around 1.5 million Japanese citizens and is the fifth of Japan's main islands. Despite now being firmly within the Japanese political and cultural system, Okinawa once formed the center of another Pacific kingdom. In fact, Okinawa and its surroundings are relatively recent additions to the Japanese nation. For centuries, they were an independent sister to their larger neighbor in the north. From the mid-15th century until the late 19th, these islands stood independent and proud. This is the story of the Ryukyu Kingdom. At the dawn of time, the sibling deities Shinrikyu and Amaikyu were directed by the kami to create the first land and the first people. These siblings created the islands of Ryukyu and the first three children. The first son, who would be the ruler, the first daughter, who would be the priestess, and the second son, who would be the farmer. This formed the legendary basis of Okinawan and Ryukyuan society. The Ryukyu Kingdom has its practical origins in the 15th century, during the Sanzan period, in which the island of Okinawa was divided into three independent kingdoms. Also, I just lied to you. The Ryukyu Kingdom had been legendarily founded and dissolved multiple times before breaking up into smaller areas of control on Okinawa and being founded again. The fact of the matter is that there simply isn't much information available before the Sanzan period, and so for practical purposes, this is where the story starts. Just remember that Okinawa is a very small island, and it would hardly be unusual for a single entity to be able to rule all of it. Anyway, back to the 15th century. The king of Chuzan, which was the southernmost kingdom, conquered the north of the island and established a single state that covered the entirety of Okinawa in 1429. This king was called Shohashi and remains a legendary figure in Okinawan history. At this early stage of history, the island was broadly subservient to China. As such, when Shou conquered the island, he had to seek recognition from the Zhandi Emperor in China, who gave it by sending a ceremonial robe and a tablet with the word Chuzan inscribed on it. When the kingdom was finally unified, Shuri Castle, the capital of the central district, was declared the capital of the newly united kingdom. This castle would later become a national museum. Given its small size and population, the Ryukyu Kingdom was always in a precarious position regarding its neighbors. China, Korea, and Japan were each fully capable of conquering the island should the mood strike them. And so, over the course of centuries dating back even before the founding of the kingdom, the islands had engaged in appeasement through tribute. Both the Chinese and Japanese received payments of food, money, and warriors through various points in history, in exchange for continuing to recognize the existence of Ryukyu. With the accession of each new king, investiture had to be sought from the Chinese emperor before their rule was considered official. Politically, the kingdom operated in a feudal system, in which the lords of the former kingdoms of the island served as local leaders, or aji, under the king. The king governed the country from the capital in Shuri, which is today a district of Okinawa's capital, Naha. However, as with most feudal kingdoms, the island wasn't the most stable thing in the world. The first Shou dynasty ruled the kingdom from 1429 until only 1469. Despite only being a period of 40 years, there were more than 6 kings, with an average reign of only 12 years. 3 of these kings were the son of Shohashi himself, while the other 2 were grandchildren. Little is known of these men, but times of succession appear to be violent, and Shuri Castle was destroyed in at least one succession dispute in this period. The most prominent of these kings are Shou Taikyu, who was king from 1454 until 1460, and his son, Shou Toku, who ruled from 1460 until 1469. Shou Taikyu took the throne after an alleged succession dispute caused a fire in the palace and killed both the sons of the previous king. As the brother of the dead king, the throne then went to him. If it sounds suspicious that both princes would die in a palace fire, allow me to congratulate you on having a brain. There's a fairly good chance that the fire was just a story made up by Shou Taikyu to cover up the murder of the princes. In any case, in 1854, he took power in Ryukyu and set about reforming the country. Taikyu was a devout Buddhist, and upon taking power he immediately set about the construction of new temples all across the kingdom. He also redoubled efforts to turn Okinawa into a major hub of trade in the region. His reign is most famous for the Bridge of Nations bell, which he ordered to be made, in which an inscription of the kingdom's prosperity and success was carved. The bell was unfortunately damaged during the World War and is no longer on display, but while it was still in good condition, it was a symbol of the nation. The bell partly reads, "The kingdom forms a bridge between all the nations, filling its lands with the precious goods and products of foreign lands." Or at least, it says something to that effect. I don't read Ryukyuan, and translations are never entirely accurate. Having made use of Okinawa's position to advance trade, it would seem like his reign would be a success. But no. His devotion to the Buddhist faith ended up bankrupting the country through the construction of far too many temples, and he was not politically savvy enough to keep a close eye on his advisors. His reign ended in 1460 with a civil war and a succession crisis, as well as a bankrupt treasury. Following this, Shotoku took the throne and attempted to revitalize the country with an invasion of the island of Kikai to expand the kingdom's borders. Kikai became a territory of the kingdom, but was so small that it didn't do much but cost money Ryukyu didn't have. Also, the South China Seas at this point in time were notorious for piracy, and Okinawa's small ships and intense focus on trade made it a tempting target. For having wasted what little money they had on a vanity conquest, Shotoku lost the faith of the royal court. Important figures, including the treasurer, resigned their positions and left for the countryside. Toku also allegedly began an affair with a priestess on Kudaka Island, a holy territory of the kingdom, that left him distracted from ruling. Whatever the case, he died in only 1469 from unknown causes. After this remarkably unsuccessful dynasty came the creatively named Second Dynasty. Despite his family having no connection to the first, the name was taken on as a symbol of continuity, as the surname Shou had been bestowed by the Chinese emperor decades earlier. The former treasurer staged a coup in the power vacuum after Toku's death and took the name Shou-en. En immediately declared the members of the former dynasty forbidden from rule, high positions in the government, or marrying the royal family. All fairly popular moves, given that in the space of 40 years they had already had numerous civil wars, assassinations, bankruptcy, and pointless foreign conflicts. He also devolved administration from the absolute rule of the king to a more Chinese-style bureaucracy that would prove long-lasting and a stabilizing influence. The Second Shou dynasty would reign until the kingdom's dissolution in 1879 and would have many successful monarchs. However, a dry list of the achievements of every single one sounds quite boring, so I'll focus on the most notable. It would be the son of Shou-en, Shou-shin, that would prove to be Ryukyu's greatest king. He ruled for more than 50 years, from 1477 to 1527, and oversaw a period of prosperity that wouldn't be matched again in the history of the kingdom. Traders from Okinawa were welcomed in ports all across the region, and in a time of massive upheaval across Asia, Okinawa was an island of stability. The population reached around 100,000 during his reign, and civil war was brought to an end. The private armies of the feudal lords were abolished, and private weapons were banned. Additionally, the lords were moved to the capital of Shuri, helping to sever the local rivalries and build a more national identity. With a focus on international trade, the exploitation of the peasant class also lessened, as there were other, better sources of wealth for the lords. With this influx of wealth and new urban life, Okinawa also began for the first time to specialize in its own luxury goods, without having to import them from overseas. The historian George Kerr described his reign succinctly. Okinawa had reached the peak of its prosperity and had perfected, in general terms, the institutions and social norms which were to remain intact until the late 19th century. China loomed as the neighbor of unquestioned superiority, and they were in close and constant communication with Japan, but were overwhelmed by neither. After Shoshin's death, the kingdom would enter a period of decline, though it would not be an unpleasant place to live by any means. Despite, or perhaps because of, how small Okinawa is, the villagers of the island developed cultures that were quite insular. Communication with members of other villages was discouraged, and marriage outside a village was considered taboo. Males of standing and power were often paired with a female, usually their sister, who could help guide him through religious power. This particular religious belief probably dates back to the original creation myth. The sibling deities created Okinawa together, and siblings must rely on one another to effectively govern it. As this was a small medieval kingdom and not a modern nation-state, there was no official flag that can be used to represent the country. However, there is evidence to suggest that the ruling family adopted the Mutsudome as their royal crest, and this became the unofficial symbol of the nation. This is also what Paradox uses for its games, and so as far as pop history is concerned, this is the flag. Due to its position as a trade hub between larger cultures, Ryukyu always had something of a syncretic culture, borrowing and modifying from many religions and people to make something unique to the islands. Traditional Okinawan religion was also similar to Japanese folk religion, in its belief in the existence of kami spirits that inhabited all things. Much like Japanese religion, this sort of folk belief lacked the same rigid structure as other religions. Priests of temples were not trained for their position. Notably, women commanded the chief positions in religious leadership, with men always serving as secondary officials. The influence wielded by women in Ryukyuan society was unusual for the time period, when positions of authority all across the world were dominated by men. The religious power vested within the priestess was enough to cause actual political change. In 1477, the priestess assigned to the king convinced him to abdicate after only 6 months of power, based on a divine message she claimed to have seen. The religion was codified in 1429 under the reign of Shohashi. From this point onward, state-appointed priestesses were given supervision over kami worship. Even so, worship remained a largely private affair and wasn't the same sort of communal activity that one would see in a church or mosque. As such, exact practices varied from house to house. I don't want to sound too glib, but the religion was really more of a vibe than the exact dogma that would be familiar in the West. To make matters even more difficult when discussing the religion, the lack of communication between villages adds another layer of complexity. Even if one village had managed to create a uniform religious system among all its members, the next village along would have no incentive to practice the same way. In 1602, with the accession of the new Tokugawa shogun in Japan, it was felt that the time had come to formalize the status of the Ryukyu Kingdom within the political structure of Japan. This didn't mean it would be incorporated into the country just yet, but it did mean that the occasional acknowledgement and a bit of tribute wasn't going to cut it anymore. In 1603, the shogun sent a message to Okinawa, asking for the islands to formally submit to the power of the shogun. This message was ignored. That same year, sailors from the islands were beached in Japan near Sendai. These men were kindly returned to Ryukyu, along with another, less polite message to submit to the shogun. Again, this was ignored. The end of total Ryukyu independence came in 1609. The lords of the Satsuma domain sent out an invasion force to force the Ryukyu Kingdom into becoming a vassal of the Japanese state. After snubbing the shogun repeatedly, this invasion took place with the full approval of the shogun himself. You may not know this, but Japan is a very powerful country, and the Ryukyu Kingdom was a very weak one. As such, things went about as well as one could hope. The attack was completed within only a few months, and the king of Ryukyu surrendered in December of that year. The king and his advisors were made to swear allegiance to the Shimazu clan that ruled Satsuma, and declared that the islands of Ryukyu have from ancient times been a feudal dependency of Satsuma. They were forced to accept full responsibility for the invasion as punishment for not providing tribute, and to swear allegiance to the Satsuma domain over their own king. Any who refused were beheaded. From this point onwards, Ryukyu provided regular taxes to Japan. Nevertheless, they weren't quite part of it just yet. They retained their nominal independence, along with their political structures and king. They still had a separate language and culture. This was actually reinforced by the island's new overlords, who did everything in their power to keep the Japanese and natives separate. New laws were implemented forbidding interaction between the natives and Japanese, and travel was heavily restricted. Japan was more than happy to take the tribute, but this was still a time of Japanese isolationism, and foreigners were, to put it mildly, unpopular. The status quo continued virtually unchanged until, in the middle of the 19th century, the United States arrived. In the 1850s, the American Commodore Perry visited the kingdom and demanded that trade relations be opened with the United States. This was only a pit stop on the way to the larger prize of Japan itself, but it did nevertheless show that even as late as the 1850s, Ryukyu maintained enough prestige to be worth threatening independently. Nevertheless, the world was changing rapidly, and Japan began its long path to industrialization. Only 20 years later, the shogun had been removed from power, and the empire was restored. The new Japanese government could no longer afford to have its tributary state operate as a mere appendage of the empire, and in 1879 they officially dissolved the kingdom of Ryukyu, absorbing it into Japan proper. The 290,000-odd Ryukyans became citizens of Japan, as they have mostly stayed since. When the Japanese government took control of the islands, they embarked on an assimilation campaign that would prove highly effective. The last king, Shotai, was exiled to Japan, where he would spend the remainder of his life. As compensation, the Sho family was given an official position within the Japanese nobility, with Shotai as a marquess. This worked out great for them until the Second World War, when the nobility was abolished. Local religion was also undermined in favor of a Japanese-centric belief system, which emphasized males. In 1944, the last of the former chief priestesses died, and the religion is now effectively indistinguishable from the mainland. Starting in the 1890s, the Japanese authorities also suppressed the native Ryukyuan languages in favor of Japanese. By the Second World War, the speaking of native languages was officially illegal, and the military assumed that most people who were speaking it had Allied sympathies. This has resulted in what is effectively their extinction, and fluency is restricted to the older generation, and younger people have very little knowledge of the native languages. Economically, up until the Second World War, the islands were still primarily based around fishing. The islands were never given the same economic priority as other areas of the country, and to this day they remain underdeveloped when compared to the main islands of Japan. During the Second World War, the American invasion of Okinawa destroyed most of the island's buildings, as well as laying waste to most of the Ryukyuan history there. The majority of the historical Okinawan buildings on the island aren't original, but reconstructions from the mid-20th century. The former kingdom certainly has a stronger surviving identity than other countries I've talked about, but it's still closer to a regional culture than a separate national one. The assimilation campaigns from the Meiji era lasted until the mid-20th century, and they were highly effective. The current status of the Ryukyuan languages are difficult to verify for sure, but the United Nations has speculated that all the native languages will be extinct by 2050. That said, dead languages have been revived before, so it's not impossible that there will be a cultural revival should sufficient public interest be generated. Also, the local Okinawan government is taking more of an interest in their Ryukyuan history today than they have in the past, so who knows. Today, the former Ryukyu Kingdom is firmly cemented within Japan and Japanese society, and short of a global cataclysm causing total government breakdown, it's unlikely the island will be regaining independence anytime soon. Though from what I can tell, very few people even want to anyway. Independence activism remains the domain of a few fringe groups rather than being a legitimate political force. The old Ryukyuan royal family still exists, though. The current king is Sho Mamoru, who lives in Tokyo and still promotes Okinawan cultural initiatives. And that's the story of the Ryukyu Kingdom. Some prosperous little islands that managed their situation about as well as any country could, but ultimately were just too small and too insignificant to make the distance.